So one of the things I've experimented with in my actuarial maths lecture course in order to improve the student experience of feedback is providing some self-test questions on Blackboard. This, I hope, is a way that the students get more feedback without an extra marking resource being required. Also, they get immediate feedback and they can get very much targeted feedback to help them understand their misconceptions and work out where they're going wrong with problems. So Blackboard actually has the possibility to construct a whole variety of different question types, in fact. So you can do, for example, calculated questions, which include a random number generator, so every time the student sees the question they get different numbers. That's quite useful for numerical questions. Or you can do sort of old-fashioned multiple choice questions with different answers. I think there's quite a lot of controversy about multiple choice questions. Some people would say they're completely useless for maths, or they're completely inappropriate for summative assessment. But I think that certainly for formative assessment, they can be quite useful if you put a little bit of effort in to choose the wrong answers to be wrong answers which reflect the common misconceptions that the students often make. And then you can provide targeted feedback for those misconceptions. So for example, an example of a simple numerical question. This is a question about discount and interest. So the student is told the effective discount rate, which is the interest paid in advance, and they're asked to calculate how much interest must be paid in arrears. And they get a choice of 5 monetary answers. And then depending on what they pick, they get feedback about why the answer is wrong. So for example, if you choose here £2.49, then you're immediately told, no, that's wrong because that's the interest that you would pay in advance, whereas the question very clearly says we want the interest paid in arrears. So hopefully the student then sees, yes, there's this difference between advance and arrears. They make sure they understand that difference, and they start to look in this kind of question for these kind of details, these kind of clues. Okay, we're paying in arrears here. And this is a kind of question that might very often come up in an exam, so it's important that they learn how to interpret the words in this question in order to calculate the right thing. On the other hand, if, for example, they've chosen the answer £7.67, then the feedback they get is to think carefully about the correct value of P, which in this case is related to how frequently the interest is paid. So sometimes I give them slightly obtuse feedback like this. I don't simply say, you're wrong, P here is 6, not P is 2, but I get them to think about what the value should be and why they might be wrong. So that hopefully they then get a better idea of really what's going on, and they can do similar questions in the future. You can also do slightly more conceptual questions rather than numerical questions. So, for example, this is a question about present values, very simple conceptual question. Suppose that in 3 years you're going to get £5,000. If the rate of interest were to increase, what would happen to the present value of that money to you? Would that be more, less, or the same? So actually a very simple question, but really gets to the heart of what actuaries mean by this notion of present value. So you can have simply 3 answers there, and then feedback based on the answers given. You can also, with a little bit more work, because Blackboard is not ideal for mathematical notation, set questions that involve actual algebraic manipulation, symbolic calculations. So for example, there's a question here about the relations between various life table functions. So these relate probabilities of living and dying at different ages. And the question is, well, which of these following expressions, which look quite complicated, is not equivalent to the others? So the student has to go away, they have to think, how can I relate these symbols in terms of these symbols? Is this the same? Is this not the same? And because it's a question which says which is not equivalent, they really have to go through and check all of the possible answers. And then again, you can give feedback based on what they've selected. Something else I've used multiple choice questions for is trying to drum into the students the slightly obtuse actuarial notation they need to know. So for example, there's a question here about the correct symbol for a particular quantity of policy value. The students get 6 possible symbols or combinations of symbols, and they have to choose here not just the right answer, but any of these answers which are correct. So this is another way that you stop the students just looking for the one correct answer. You get them really to think about all of the possible answers and when they might be right or they might be wrong. If they're wrong, why are they wrong? And so on. And again, you can give feedback. So for example, if the student here chooses answer B, which is very similar in some ways to an answer I would expect them to choose, then they're told, no, that's not right, that's the symbol for the loss, whereas actually what you were asked for was the policy value. And you're given a hint that the policy value is the expectation of the loss. So again, you're trying to emphasise the fundamental connections between these different concepts. And very often what I do, both in the targeted feedback for an individual question and in any general feedback I give for that question, I give references to the notes. If you didn't get this right, why don't you look at this example in the notes? Why don't you look at this section? To try and again build up links between these questions and the notes. And I think many of the students have found this quite useful. It's entirely voluntary. I can't see how they're doing. I can see who engages with the software, but I can't see what answers they're getting. But I've encouraged them to try these questions before they do the weekly coursework. And sometimes there's a bit of carrot. I will make one of the questions on the coursework quite similar to one of these questions so that they can see, having tried these questions, how that helps them with the coursework. And they can go away and they can try these things as many times as they like. I saw in particular, looking at the stats, that lots of people were using the self-tests running up to the exams, and try and really understand what's going on and get immediate feedback about where they're going right and where they're going wrong. So I think carefully written questions like this can be quite useful as an additional tool for providing feedback and also promoting student understanding.